Before we begin an example that demonstrates the basics behind activity-based costing, let's review the page in your lecture notes that just shows you 4 basic steps for implementing ABC. In step 1, you will identify and classify the major activities involved in the manufacture of specific products and allocate overhead costs to the appropriate cost pools. So this is where management will identify the various cost pools and identify the activity base that causes this cost to be incurred. So they may group all of the costs related to purchase orders into a purchasing cost pool and all of the costs related to setting up machines into a setup cost pool. So they identify their cost pools. And in step 2, they identify the cost driver that has a strong correlation, meaning incurrence of activity would cause incurrence of cost. So some examples of this would be if you had a purchasing cost pool, you might allocate based on number of purchase orders. It might be pounds purchased or number of items purchased. It really just depends on what the company thinks is the best cost driver. Machine setup, it might be number of setups required or it might be number of batches. If you set up the machines before each production run, like you would if you were making ballpoint pens, you would have to load the correct color of ink, blue ink, and blue casing before you run the blue pens. Processing, that might be machine hours, direct labor dollars, or units produced. It depends on if it's a machine intensive or a labor intensive process. Assembly, number of parts assembled, number of units, or some kind of labor-based allocation would be good there. Inspection might be number of units if you inspect every 100th unit, number of inspections required if you want to keep track of how many inspections you do, or number of batches if you inspect, say, 2 per batch. Shipping, this could be number of items shipped, pounds shipped, or number of shipments. The idea is there's not one set way that you would allocate costs. The company would analyze the best cost driver for each of their cost pools. In your problems, this would be called the stage 1 allocation, and to simplify our coverage, this is typically done for you in your problems. You'll be looking for what are the cost pools and what drives each of them. And in step 3, you'll calculate the activity rates. This will be for each of your cost pools, so you might have a purchasing activity rate, a setup activity rate, a processing activity rate, etc. And you'll take the cost related to that activity divided by the total cost driver for that activity. This is very much like your predetermined overhead rate, so this is really not a new formula. And then in step 4, you will assign overhead costs to products, customers, or whatever cost object you're trying to cost out, and you'll take that overhead activity rate times the number of the cost driver expected. So you might take the purchasing activity rate times number of purchase orders and assign cost to a given product line or a given customer order. All right, so you will have to estimate this in order to make this effective, because you have to do this in advance so that you know what prices to charge. Is it expected to be a profitable product line or customer order? So overall, ABC is very similar to your traditional costing that we've learned about in chapters 2 and 3, but what you'll see is that there's multiple activity rates instead of a plant-wide or departmental overhead rates to assign those indirect costs to product lines or customer orders or just to a given unit. Stay tuned, we'll work a problem next. In this example, we'll take a basic look at activity-based costing. LDA Draperies, Inc. makes custom draperies for homes and businesses. The company uses an activity-based costing system for its overhead costs. The company has allocated the manufacturing overhead costs to the activities, that is the stage 1 allocation, required to produce the products as shown below. Cutting and sewing, $80,000. Product design costs, $30,000. Machine setup, $5,000. Cutting and sewing cost is allocated based on labor hours, and product design costs are allocated to each product line. Expected activity information is shown below. We're going to make 500 units of the home drape line and 1,500 units of the business drape line. To do that, the home line will need 800 direct labor hours and the business line will need 1,200 direct labor hours. For the home line, we'll need 20 setups, and for the business line, we'll need 30 setups. Which product line consumes relatively more resources on a per unit basis? Now, this question is simply trying to demonstrate why activity-based costing might be useful. We were given that we will make 500 home drapes and 1,500 business drapes. So notice that LDA makes 3 times as many business drapes as home drapes, 1,500 versus 500. But also notice the activity. The business line does not require 3 times the resources. If you look at labor hours, 1,200 are needed for the business line, but only 800 for the home line. 20 setups are needed for the home line and 30 setups are needed for the business line. So while the business line does require more resources, it does not require 3 times the amount of resources. So this indicates that the home drape line really does consume more resources if you look at it on a per unit basis. So when we're trying to assign cost to each unit, the home drape should get more overhead costs. Compute the activity rates for each of the activities required. So we had 3 activities: cutting and sewing, design, and setup. For the cutting and sewing line, there were $80,000 of cost expected, and we were told that they allocate costs based on labor hours. So we totaled the labor hours needed, 800 plus 1,200. We get 2,000 hours, and the rate is $40 per direct labor hour. For design costs, we had $30,000. They didn't tell us the exact quantity when they gave us the list, but we know that there were 2 product lines. So we will divide by 2, and each product line will be assigned $15,000 of design cost. Setup, $5,000 of cost expected. With 50 setups, that's 20 plus 30, and we get $100 per setup. So these are our activity rates. Now we can allocate costs to any given cost object. In this case, we're told determine the manufacturing overhead cost per unit for the home products line under ABC. So we're only allocating to the home products line, but we will need to allocate from all 3 of the cost pools. From cutting and sewing, it will be $40 per direct labor hour times 800 direct labor hours required from the home line, or $32,000. From design, it's $15,000 per line, and the home products line is one of 2 lines. So we'll multiply by 1 and we get $15,000. And for setup, it would be $100 per setup times the 20 setups required from the home products line. That's $2,000 allocated to the home line. If we add this up, the total overhead allocated will be $49,000. We'll divide by the number of units, and if you'll recall, we're going to produce 500 units of the home line, and this gives us an overhead cost per unit of $98. So we're going to work a more comprehensive problem, but what we want to remember is that we start with an analysis of every activity performed to produce a product or a service, and then we will allocate based on consumption of resources. This is time consuming, but it may be beneficial. We'll work a longer problem, a more comprehensive problem, next time. See you then.